Hi everyone, this is Dr. Liz, and you're listening to Include with Dr. Liz. This show is about everyone, all people, including you. It's about people and their diverse lived experience in this world. I chat with guests to get to know them, their identities, and their inclusion needs, so we all have an opportunity to understand how best to include them, so together we can create a world where everyone thrives. A self-proclaimed student of life's lessons, Dwight is a vegan eating, grief surviving, social connecting veteran. His greatest achievement was finding his own voice and lives every day appreciating the sweetness of life. As a social intelligence coach and event host, Dwight is passionate about designing experiences that create psychological safety and encourage vulnerable sharing to create meaningful connections. Welcome, Dwight.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Liz.
Psychological safety, it's one of those words that's becoming more and more used.
Well, and it's always a joy whenever I can know that I can bring people into a space and they can feel comfortable. I know that a big part of psychological safety comes from within, and part of it is allowing people to give themselves permission to feel like they belong.
And I think the way I've always done that naturally rather than considered, which I do more considered psychological safety than in the past, is that I used to always just be so open and transparent about myself because I felt like if I just put everything on the table, then I made it okay for everybody else to put everything on the table. But before we go down that rabbit hole, everyone completes a questionnaire and in advance of the episode. And I read something around that you were a full-time caregiver for your husband with advanced liver disease during the pandemic lockdowns. I mean,
yes,
that's a lot. Can you share with, people what that was for you over the last couple of years and how that's impacted you?
Absolutely. I remember what it was like in early 2020 when we were all told that we would have to go to our homes and limit any of our time just going about things that we took for granted before. On top of that, I had to deal with the sickness that my husband was going through, and we were still trying to figure things out. All of 2020, we were still grabbing at straws to figure out what was happening. We had a battery of tests from a psychologist, and we're dealing with a diagnosis of severe mental impairment. And we were trying to work through those coping strategies, but it was in that process that we finally got connected with a liver specialist that connected the dots for us, because we were starting to deal with declining mobility and all sorts of strange things and that resulted in his body just failing him. Mm-hmm. And while we were doing that, we wound up spending a great deal of time in hospitals during the peak times of stress on the medical system. I remember early on, I was allowed to visit him for 1 hour out of every day. And there was a protocol just to go in. And those early hospitalizations were just training for the things that were to come, because the final 2 years, we would bounce in and out of hospitals, and I got to spend a month alongside him in a skilled nursing facility. And we accelerated our relationship during that time because it was, in his words, some of the worst things that we could go through, but one of the best things to draw us closer together.
That's powerful. You're a grief survivor. So I take from that he has passed away.
He died in early March of 22.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
Well, thank you. It was one of those things where even though things looked grim. There's nothing that really prepares you for it. When it finally happened, I was devastated because we'd had so many instances where we were given access to treatments that were experimental, and we'd experienced some successes with them. And so the hope was building. His last hospitalization, it was just so dire. There was a point at which the machines that were keeping him alive were also doing him such great harm that it was just cruel to try to prolong his life only to make his existence so painful.
Yeah.
And I was not prepared for what it would be like once he was gone.
Yeah.
It couldn't have hurt me more if I had been physically wounded. I mean, the pain was so intense.
Yeah. I've been there. My son died by suicide in January last year. So I know
I'm
that
so sorry.
immense grief that is beyond anything comprehensible. And a little like you're describing, there's so many layers to it. You had someone with chronic/acute illness, right, that you had to take them through over a period of years. My son was an addict. And so I had all those years of stress and worry and care and concern as well. So even though, just like you, I had hope, but I also knew there was a likelihood, and it doesn't make it easier.
No, it doesn't.
So I'm with you, Dwight. I actually feel a little physically ill right now in my empathy towards both of our experiences, I guess. Okay, but that's only part of you. That's not all of you.
Right.
And I think for a few months, that was all of me. So I can imagine you spent several months about that being all of you. But every questionnaire that a participant completes, big long list of identities, and you ticked 6 of them. What were they for you?
Well, goodness, I ticked male, LGBTQIA+, racial minority, religious minority, cognitive disability, and neurodiverse as a highly sensitive person.
Okay. So thank you for sharing those. And
Thank you.
I believe in seeing the whole person and all those intersectionalities woven together. But because we just spoke about time that you had to navigate the healthcare system in a gay relationship, I'm curious, did it impact your experience in receiving healthcare and you as a primary carer throughout that time?
Thankfully, the one saving grace about when we went through it was we had the benefit of going through our medical journey during an era of marriage equality. Thankfully, I was legally and in every manner that mattered the immediate family for him, and in every medical setting, thankfully, I was never denied access.
I am curious because you mentioned you are in Texas.
Yes.
And socially there are different norms. So I'm wondering, in terms of humanistic treatment, do you think there was any difference to the way you and your husband were treated as a married couple than perhaps if there had been a straight couple going through the same experience?
There are some areas where we could feel the clock turning back several years. Thankfully, I today live in a rather liberal enclave surrounded by a lot of incredibly judgmental and closed off suburbs. Dallas is unique in that it is not like a lot of its neighbors. A lot of the cities formed to take advantage of having a smaller tax base, but they also get to stand up what they will collectively call their values, or pursue their way of life, which is coded language for things that promote policies that are a bit racist and otherwise just a bit backward.
when there's legislation that's being turned over, and I just want to bring up the, marriage equality, so important, because if you hadn't had that, you wouldn't have that recognition, and it, I guess, not being law that you had to be acknowledged and recognized as family. What does it do to you and people like you when it starts to become a question again? When Roe versus Wade is reversed, and then it starts to create questions and doubt around equality. Tell me the impact of that.
Well, I can't help but look at it with eyes wide open. When we started looking at the way that the country shifted and how all of a sudden a woman's right to choose was something that was up for question again. It's a completely different world today than it was just a couple of years ago.
I think you say it right, that you're almost shocked that the world can go backwards.
To see it happen to one thing, you can't help but question what other aspects of life is that a possibility for.
Exactly. The comparisons that people draw to The Handmaid's Tale. Have you seen that? Yeah. And yes, it seems like dystopian and weird and impossible, but when it comes to immigration, I always say to people, you should watch that and say, would you stop those people, and seeing that lived experience, would you stop them crossing the border into Canada? Like, is that fair? When I asked the question around all their identities, I provided an opportunity for other. Now, the identities that I list are generally protected identities. They're seen as something that legally you can't discriminate against. So then I provide the other, and under other, you wrote widower and vegan.
Yes.
So do you know, because grief isn't a protected, right? It's not a protected identity, but it absolutely is part of our inclusion needs. So I'm so totally with you on that one. And then it was interesting for me where you wrote vegan. Okay, because on this, I mean, there's always the joke, there's a vegan in the room because I'll tell you, but don't worry, I'm not teasing you. The reason I mention it is because when, for instance, I'm equipping people to be inclusive, say, of religious identities in the workplace, I help them understand the importance of recognizing dietary requirements and needs. And I always say, I want to get us to a place where we are seeking to ask what people's inclusion needs are as simply as we do on a wedding invitation. Like, do you have dietary requirements?
Right.
Now, when we just were chatting before we pressed record on today's episode, you were saying that leaning into who you are and finding your voice and authentically being you in the spaces that you occupy has been a bit of a journey for you.
Yes.
So can you tell me first, before we talk about when you recognized it was time to shed the mask and be you, tell me why? Why have you not been able to be you?
Oh, my goodness. I would say that it started at the very early points in my life where I got messaging either subtly, and it was not overtly stated, but there were definite ways that people around me wanted me to be. And then there were ways that were rather explicit. It was actually great preparation because at the age of 23, I entered an enlistment. I went into the U.S. Army during the era known as Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I actually had to sign recruitment paperwork that had passages scratched out that asked about sexual orientation. And I successfully made it through all of that. I maintained a position that required a security clearance, meaning that it also required a background investigation performed by the Defense Intelligence Agency that found out I was gay, but they were powerless to do anything about it because I was under no obligation to tell them that I was. And the last year of my enlistment was spent in a lot of rooms with the Defense Intelligence agent trying to get me to trip up.
Well,
yeah.
I'm so Sorry, I'm flabbergasted. I just want to go back a bit. What year are we talking here?
I was enlisted from 1998 to 2002. So for
oh, Dwight, that is so recent. Okay, look, I'm putting myself in your shoes. I can't imagine filling out a form and it asking, "Are you straight?" It's like you're going for a job. You're like, how is this relevant? So if I think it's ridiculous to be asked if I'm to tick a box if I'm straight, it's just as ridiculous to be asked, are you gay? Like, it's just stupid. Tell me about, you're not allowed to tell who you are. You can't be who you are. You can't talk about your partner. You can't talk about what you did on the weekend. Like, what does it do to a person?
I will say that during the enlistment, I definitely had to look over my shoulder all the time. I knew that when the Defense Intelligence Agency came after me, that I need to seek help. And thankfully, there were some organizations that were set up to give soldiers legal aid. And I had to take advantage of those services. I don't know what I would have done had I not found them. They have a great deal of time and manpower behind them dedicated to allowing them to get to the end of whatever it is that they're trying to find out.
What's their intent? Like, to trip you up and then what? Like, find out you're gay and then what?
Well, at the time, it was actually illegal for me to be gay, but they were powerless.
Illegal to be gay while working
as a soldier in the Army in that era, yes.
I want people to reflect for just a moment. This was just 20 years ago-ish.
Mm-hmm.
Illegal to be you in a job. Look, I knew there would have been discrimination and harassment and bullying and all that kind of thing. You know, there would have been career suppression. I mean, I expected that. I didn't know that it was illegal. I'm sorry, I'm giggling. I'm giggling out of how absurd it is, Dwight.
To put it in sharper relief, the penalties for violating the law could have been as severe as separation or incarceration in a federal prison.
So you then voluntarily left the military, I'm guessing?
Yes, thankfully the contract expired.
Did you find yourself a healthier workplace after that?
There was nowhere to go but up.
You couldn't go any lower. Okay, you were starting with a really low baseline. You spent these years in the military really hiding yourself.
Yes.
So you leave. Tell me about the process after that. I'm guessing you had to rediscover who you were.
There was a sense of relief, but I was also looking over my shoulder because the thing about the enlistment contracts, everyone that finishes an enlistment is still a part of what they call the Ready Reserve. It's a pool of people that they could call back into service at any time. I remembered signing paperwork that told me about this, and so it was something that was always in the back of my mind. And so an additional 4 years after my enlistment, I was a little bit worried, a little nervous. But I went on with my life working for a large software company that prided itself on diversity and grew to become one of the largest software companies serving local government.
Okay. And so, you know, when you describe working for a company that says they pride themselves on diversity, mm-hmm. Tell me about how that workplace feels different for you in contrast, let's say, to the military, where you would have been jailed for being you. Oh my goodness. Ridiculous.
I've gotten to see things change over time. The company was one of several that was acquired by a larger company. And the contrast between the smaller organization and the larger one that it eventually became a part of, a lot of the local values and norms were more prevalent in the smaller organization. And I will say that things shift a little once you take on federal contracts. When you go to the bigger organization, there's always an effort to move forward. So before marriage equality in the larger organization, I had the benefit of being able to take advantage of domestic partner health benefits, which was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It was wonderful. I was in disbelief because imagine having experienced what it is to live under don't ask, don't tell and have that be a very real part of your life to suddenly being able to know that you can make sure that your partner's healthcare needs are going to be taken care of.
Yeah. I mean, and particularly for our international listeners where we have universal health care, you wouldn't naturally think of that as being one of the really important benefits of marriage equality and recognition of domestic partnerships. So in terms of your identities, you listed 6. We've kind of tapped into your sexual identity.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about how racial identity has played out for you across your life and potentially intersecting with your sexual identity.
Oh my goodness. Hard for me not to think of what it was like to go and visit my grandmother in East Texas, having that real contrast of what it was like to be in the piney woods of East Texas and into Louisiana, where values are just different. There's a real pressure to conform. There's a real respect for what they put under the umbrella of family values. And that is a nice way of being able to package a whole lot of norms that say that gay is not okay.
Mm-hmm.
There are also a lot of other ways that the Jim Crow South has survived and I would dare say thrived in a lot of those communities. Things are changing a bit, but you'll still find pockets. I did get to experience firsthand what it was like to go through what they call a sunset town. To just put it simply, you might see signs that will say that you should make sure that you have left the town if you're a person of color, to put it kindly. But they do not use language as flowery as that.
Right.
The threat being that you could find yourself in harm's way. You could find yourself either jailed or disappeared. There are pockets where it still exists. I remember having the experience of being tasked to go to Jasper, Texas, shortly after a black man was dragged to his death behind a pickup truck.
I think I remember that. I remember hearing that.
This was while I was working for the big software company for whom that county was one of the clients.
What's going on for you when you're traveling there for work? Like, help me understand. If I was your manager, what do I need to understand?
I took a page from the playbook of realtors where I overdressed and I did everything I could to apply every social nicety.
I don't want you to have to do that, Dwight. That's not the purpose of this podcast, right?
Right.
Okay, let's flip the switch on this one.
Sure.
Let's say I am working on the software project that you're coming down into that county to assist me with. So I work for the county and I don't subscribe to the exclusionary practices of the rest of the town and its values. So what can I do to make you feel safe so that you can be you?
Oh my goodness. In that situation, it would be incredibly difficult because as you can imagine, it was an electricity that was in the air. The thing about having to work on these extended projects, we are involved for a long time. We wind up being a part of the community. We'll stay in the hotels and we'll more or less live on the economy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of hard to separate ourselves. We're a constant presence while these things are going on.
So, all right, there's a meeting. You come into the office and I work for the county. How do you know if you feel comfortable with me? Like, what do I need to do to make sure, even if I can't say it out loud?
Sure. Above anything else, just remember what it is to be kind. There's something really powerful in just following the example of someone like Fred Rogers, just keeping it very simple. I know that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was something that was targeted at children and designed in such a way to create predictable ways that people would know that they would have a sense of safety. But in following those patterns and in modeling what it was to greet neighbors and to treat people with genuine respect and curiosity and kindness, I think that he gave us a real gift. I think that's the best way they can serve those that might be the target, and the best way that they can help those that may be swayed into participating in such nonsense to see there's a better way.
Dwight, your empathy for people that are in these communities where, okay, they may not subscribe to those values, but you're putting yourselves in their shoes to know that when you leave, they've got to stay. So they have to navigate that. So, look, I'm sure that's appreciated, but that's not going to affect any change, is it? Look, I really want to also understand, you've described how your identities, you've had to hide, you've got to seek out your own voice. And you described in part of your identity around neurodiversity and being a highly sensitive person. Tell me, how does this work for you? How has this impacted your mental health? All of that.
Living my life without really understanding why it was that everything just seemed to have a deeper intensity for me, and thinking there was something wrong with me, or having to do my best to deal with having just feeling everything a bit more deeply than apparently I was supposed to. There were times when I could see it be a clear advantage, because I could almost take advantage of a different sense of what it was to read a room. I mean, for me, there was definitely another layer of dialogue that I was experiencing whenever I would find myself in settings. I mean, it was a huge advantage whenever I would need to lead people through discussions about change management for the software company, because I could have a real-time sense of what was happening with all the stakeholders. And at times it could be a beautiful thing. And then there are times when it can be the worst thing in the world, because it just seems like there's just so much coming at me at once.
You were even illustrating it in how you describe it, the electricity, you can cut the air, your sympathy for others and empathy and compassion and all of those things. And they're superpowers. Tell me about the difference in who you are and your power and everything about once you have found your voice and you can be authentically you in your community, in your workplace. Why does that matter, and how does it play out for you?
I've lived what it is to be told who it is that I'm supposed to be. I've had the experience of having to be a good soldier and having to follow a script and trying my best to make sure that I did everything to fall in line with expectations. Otherwise, I think that we need the freedom to fully express who we are, because when we don't, I think it comes across. I think that in large ways, it's a source of sabotage. I think that if you try to tamp down who you are for too long, then it's going to lead to illness or otherwise just not being able to fully perform, not being able to fully leverage your potential.
And I think when you're having to try to be something you're not, you'll never be good at that.
Right.
You're less than while you're trying to be something that you think someone else wants or needs or dictates you have to be in your case. I just want to ask you some quickly, because in the questionnaire as well, I asked people about their lived experience in the current state. And
sure.
around different inclusion needs. There was two particularly that jumped out for me in your responses, that the words and language people use around me always give me confidence. They value who I am. And similarly, the other question was, my history, identity, and beliefs are respectfully considered by the people I work with and in my community. So tell me about the language and the words. Why is it important, or how do you know you're not being valued with people's words and language?
I have had the lived experience of seeing what it was like to know that I was othered. I would say one of the most visceral experiences that I've had of being othered was a time early in my enlistment when someone that was in a leadership position proceeded to tell a series of gay jokes around a campfire. The interesting thing about that is that he was knowingly violating the law, but for anyone to call him out on it, they would run the risk of violating the same law. For all of the young people that were there, for any of them who might have been offended or threatened or in any way affected, they would be ending their careers if they dared to say anything.
You know the term the gaydar, right? Like,
sure.
You're in a workplace that you can't be you. It's essentially illegal to be you. Mm-hmm. You can't even say it out loud. Can you, though, tell who else is gay, who's also hiding it, but you can't say anything? Like,
that was definitely a thing.
Okay. The reason I'm asking is I'm kind of drawing the relationship back to the ERGs, so the employee reference groups that we have now in organisations, and how important it can be for underrepresented identities to have this camaraderie and being able to sort of share lived experiences and just not feel like they're alone. So that's what I'm kind of drawing back to your experience. Do you seek them out, or do you, because you're afraid, stay a long way away? I'm just curious of the impact on your behaviours.
There was a time when I would just default to my behavior of trying to hide. So I was very much alone. And that can keep you safe for just so long. There's definitely a sense of there being safety in numbers. In that particular situation, it was impossible to actually amass numbers in any way without risking the careers of everyone that was an enlisted or an officer at the time.
It makes sense, right? Like, if you start to gravitate towards each other and there's suspicions about one or two of you, but then there's a collective of you, then they go, oh, well, that's affirming.
Right.
Is it better now? Not for you, I mean for the current recruits, the people that are now working in the military.
I will say this, having lived through that experience, I grew an appreciation for civics that I think is just unheard of with most Americans. On the military front, there are still those that are trans, that are in a similar situation to what it was that I was going through. Yeah. And some of the things that they have to deal with are some of the practical aspects, like access to treatment and medications. I'm a firm believer that as long as there's anyone who is in a situation where they cannot feel like they are being given equal access, full treatment, just allowed to be fully who they are, that's a threat to all of us.
We don't have inclusion unless we all are. You've been really vulnerable and open today. Considering you were saying that you know this is a new place for you, thank you for sharing your stories today. I do want to ask, what is it that you're bringing to the world now, right?
Now I am the co-founder and a host for something that I'm calling Authentic Friends and Adventures. Mm-hmm. Our signature live events were something that we have crafted pretty much on a monthly basis over the past 18 months or so. And those are experiences that all of our guests leave wanting more of, because they get a taste of what it's like to be vulnerable and open in a place where they find support and connection in ways that just don't exist now. People find themselves being hypnotized by screens, and they've forgotten what it is to just be a human being. Another thing that we've started is a weekly pause that allows people to have just an hour where they can get together and have a moment of quiet reflection, make some connection, and to leave with an intention.
Dwight, thank you so much for your vulnerability and time today. I learned so much. My biggest takeaway particularly is about making sure I have a little more empathy for those that are on my side, if you want to call it, on inclusion's side. But when I leave the room, they have to stay. And I thank you for teaching me that today.
This has been an honor.
Okay, thank you.